The librarian saves damaged books from being thrown away, not knowing one contained a lost family fortune. Eleanor Whitfield stood at the dumpster behind Oak Ridge Public Library, her fingers trembling with a quiet rage as she watched her colleagues toss waterlogged books into the metal container with casual indifference. Last night's pipe burst had flooded the library's fiction section, leaving hundreds of books damaged beyond what the administration deemed economically viable to restore. Eleanor's heart ached with each sodden thump. 23 years as Oak Ridge's head librarian had taught her that books were more than ink and paper. They were vessels of humanity, keepers of dreams, whispers of souls long gone. And now they were being discarded like yesterday's newspaper. "Eleanor, we've been through this," sighed Director Phillips, not bothering to hide his exasperation. "The insurance will cover replacements. These are unsalvageable." She lifted her chin, the late October wind whipping strands of silver-streaked auburn hair across her face. "Then I'll take them." "What? If the library is throwing them away, then they're garbage, correct? And I'm free to take garbage." Her voice was quiet but unyielding, the same tone she'd used when patrons had attempted to challenge book selections over the decades. Phillips shrugged, clearly eager to end the conversation and return to the warmth of his office. "Fine, take your garbage. Just don't bring it back inside. We're not a storage facility for ruined books." Eleanor's small sedan groaned under the weight of 12 boxes of damaged books. She drove slowly through Oak Ridge's tree-lined streets, past the coffee shop where she'd spent countless Saturday mornings alone with paperbacks and Earl Grey, past the park where she'd once read stories to children during summer programs. The familiar route to her home felt different today, heavier, the car's burden mirroring her own. The small Victorian house at the end of Maple Street had belonged to Eleanor's parents. After they passed, 5 years apart but both gone before Eleanor turned 40, the house had become both sanctuary and prison. Too large for one person, too filled with memories to leave. Much like Eleanor herself, too full of knowledge with increasingly fewer people to share it with. Her muscles protested as she carried the first box up the porch steps. At 57, Eleanor was no stranger to the quiet indignities of aging, but today each twinge felt like a personal betrayal. Still, she persisted, making trip after trip until her living room was lined with soggy cardboard containers. That night, Eleanor worked methodically. She spread old sheets across every available surface and began the painstaking process of salvage. Each book was carefully opened, pages gently separated, the worst of the moisture blotted away with soft towels. Some were clearly beyond help, pages fused together, ink bleeding into watercolor blurs, spines warped beyond recognition. These she set aside with murmured apologies, as if the books could hear her failure. But others showed promise. With proper care, with patience, they might be saved. Hours melted away. The grandfather clock in the hallway, her father's pride, chimed midnight, then 1, then 2. Eleanor's back screamed for rest, but her hands continued their delicate work, guided by the glow of a single lamp and decades of loving books too much to surrender them easily. It was nearly 3 when she reached for a water-damaged copy of Great Expectations. The classic Dickens novel had suffered significantly, its once elegant hardcover binding partially separated, pages rippled with moisture. Yet something about it made Eleanor pause. The edition seemed unusual, older than the library's typical collection, with gilded page edges now dulled by water damage. As she carefully opened it, something fluttered from between the pages, a folded slip of yellowed paper that had somehow remained dry in the center of the book. Eleanor unfolded it with cautious fingers. It was a letter, the handwriting precise and formal. "My dearest Margaret, should this reach you, know that I have secured our family's future despite Thomas's best efforts to ruin us. The inheritance remains intact, hidden where only you would think to look, in the place where we first spoke of forever. Remember the sequence, bluestones first, then count 7 and turn left at the oak. I pray daily that you and the children are well and that we shall be reunited soon. All my love, William." April 3rd, 1937. Eleanor's exhaustion evaporated. She turned the letter over, searching for more information, but found nothing except a faint impression of what might have been an address, now illegible. The book itself offered no immediate clues, no bookplate, no ownership inscription. Just a mystery that had survived decades, floods, and very nearly a dumpster. She examined the book more carefully now. The library's processing, spine label, barcode, security strip, all appeared relatively new, perhaps from the last decade. This wasn't a long-standing part of Oak Ridge's collection. It had come from somewhere else, donated perhaps, carrying its secret between Pip's tribulations and Estella's coldness. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the boxes still awaiting her attention. Tomorrow was Sunday. The library would be closed. She had time to save more books, time to consider this strange letter from the past. As she finally allowed herself to seek her bed, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the quickening pulse of adventure, of purpose beyond the daily routine of catalogs and quiet reminders. Sleep came swiftly, but her dreams were filled with blue stones, mysterious oaks, and whispers of fortunes waiting to be found. Morning light filtered through Eleanor's bedroom curtains, painting warm stripes across the quilt her grandmother had made. For a moment, suspended between sleep and wakefulness, she forgot about the damaged books, the letter, the long night's labor. Then reality rushed back, and with it, a curious energy that propelled her from bed despite her aching muscles. After a quick breakfast of toast and tea, Eleanor returned to her living room workshop. The letter from the book rested on her coffee table, weighted down by a small crystal paperweight, another inheritance, this one from an aunt who had traveled the world while Eleanor stayed firmly rooted in Oak Ridge. She photographed the letter with her phone before carefully placing it in an acid-free document sleeve, one of many archival supplies she'd accumulated over years of caring for her own modest book collection. Then she turned her attention back to Great Expectations. The book itself yielded no further secrets, but Eleanor's trained eye noticed something she'd missed in her exhaustion, a small pencil marking on the inside back cover, the number 42, followed by what might have been an M or perhaps W. Too deliberate to be random, too discreet to be library marking. She set it aside and continued her salvage operation, but now with dual purpose, saving books and searching for clues. Most volumes offered nothing beyond their waterlogged stories, but Eleanor handled each with renewed reverence. These were not merely damaged goods, they were potential vessels of human connection, carriers of messages across time. By mid-afternoon, she had processed nearly half the boxes. Her kitchen had become a makeshift book hospital, volumes with splayed pages standing tent-like on every surface to dry, their covers carefully separated from blocks of text to prevent further damage. The most severely wounded lay flat, interleaved with absorbent paper that Eleanor changed hourly like bandages on critical patients. The doorbell's chime startled her from her work. Eleanor rarely received visitors, especially unannounced ones. She wiped her hands on her apron and made her way to the door. A young man stood on her porch, perhaps in his early 30s, with unruly dark hair and glasses that magnified earnest brown eyes. He clutched a leather messenger bag against his side with one hand, while the other hovered near the doorbell, as if contemplating a second ring. "Ms. Whitfield?" he asked, offering a tentative smile. "I'm Daniel Reeves from the Oak Ridge Historical Society. Director Phillips mentioned you might have rescued some books from yesterday's flood." Eleanor studied him with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent decades recommending books based on the briefest of interactions. His clothes, casual but neat, a tweed jacket despite the warming day, suggested academic inclinations. The Historical Society was small, volunteer-run, and perpetually underfunded. Eleanor had donated to their annual appeals but rarely encountered their members. "I did," she acknowledged, not yet moving to invite him in. "Though I'm not sure what interest the Historical Society would have in contemporary fiction with water damage." Daniel's smile widened slightly. "Actually, I was hoping some local history materials might have been mixed in. We had donated several boxes to the library last month, duplicates from our archives and some items we lack space to properly store." He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "Honestly, I've been kicking myself for not being more selective about what we gave away. There might have been items of significance I overlooked." Eleanor considered this. The library did regularly receive donations from local organizations, and she wasn't always consulted about their processing, especially in recent years, as her role had become increasingly marginalized by Director Phillips' modernization initiatives. "You'd better come in," she said finally, stepping aside. "Though I should warn you, my home currently resembles a papier-mâché workshop after an explosion." Daniel's eyes widened as he entered the living room. "You're doing conservation work." he observed, genuine admiration in his voice as he took in her careful arrangement of drying books. "I'm doing what I can," Eleanor corrected, suddenly self-conscious about her amateur efforts. "I'm a librarian, not a conservator. Sometimes they're not so different," Daniel said, setting down his bag and approaching one of her drying stations with obvious interest. "You've interleaved with blotting paper, elevated the spines, separated the covers. These are all proper techniques." He glanced at her with newfound respect. "Where did you learn this?" Eleanor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun streaming through her windows. "Books about books," she said simply. "I've had a professional interest in conservation, though limited resources to practice it." "Well, you're doing an admirable job." He gestured to the boxes still untouched. "May I?" She nodded, watching as he carefully began examining the remaining books. His hands moved with practiced confidence, gently opening covers, checking copyright pages, examining bindings. "What exactly are you looking for?" Eleanor asked after several minutes of observation. Daniel looked up, a flash of hesitation crossing his features before he answered. "The Historical Society recently received a query about a collection that passed through Oak Ridge in the late 1930s. The Harrington Collection, books and papers belonging to William Harrington, a rather successful businessman who disappeared under mysterious circumstances during the Depression." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Disappeared?" Daniel nodded, carefully setting aside a damaged cookbook. "The official story was that he absconded with company funds after his business failed. His family maintained his innocence, claimed he'd been set up by his business partner, Thomas Blackwood." He paused, glancing at Eleanor. "The timing lines up with some local history, actually. Oak Ridge had a small economic boom in the late 30s when the Blackwood Manufacturing Company established operations here." "The Blackwoods," Eleanor murmured. The name was woven through Oak Ridge's history: Blackwood Park, Blackwood Memorial Hospital, the Blackwood Wing at the very library where she worked. "You think these books might be connected to William Harrington?" "It's a long shot," Daniel admitted. "But the Historical Society recently received correspondence suggesting that some of Harrington's personal library might have ended up in Oak Ridge. When I heard about the flood and the discarded books," he shrugged. "Professional curiosity?" Eleanor moved to her coffee table and picked up the document sleeve containing the letter. "Would this be of interest to your professional curiosity?" She watched Daniel's expression transform as he read the letter, shock giving way to excitement, then settling into focused intensity. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice hushed with reverence. "In a copy of Great Expectations." She retrieved the book from her special care station and handed it to him. "There's also this marking inside the back cover." Daniel examined the notation, his fingers tracing the faded pencil marks. 42 West, he confirmed. "Could be a catalog number of some kind." He looked up at Eleanor, eyes bright behind his glasses. "Do you realize what this might be?" She did, of course. Her mind had been spinning possibilities since 3 a.m. A letter from William Harrington to his wife, suggesting he hid their fortune somewhere. "Not just somewhere," Daniel corrected, clearly struggling to contain his excitement. "Somewhere specific, somewhere with blue stones, an oak tree, and significant personal meaning." He carefully set the letter down. "Ms. Whitfield, this could be the evidence the Harrington family has sought for generations. Proof that William didn't steal the money, that he hid it to protect it from Thomas Blackwood." "Please," she said, "call me Eleanor." Something shifted between them then, a connection forming over this shared discovery, this paper bridge across decades. "Eleanor," he repeated, the name careful on his lips. "I think we may have stumbled onto something remarkable." She glanced at the remaining boxes of damaged books. "We should check them all. There might be more." Daniel nodded eagerly. "I'll help." 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1. And so they worked together as afternoon stretched into evening. Daniel proved to be not just knowledgeable but gentle with the damaged volumes, his movements as careful as Eleanor's own. They developed a rhythm. She would open and assess each book. He would examine any markings or unusual features, and together they would decide on appropriate conservation measures. They found no more letters, but 3 additional books bore the same 42W. Marking, a collection of Wordsworth poetry, a botanical guide to New England flora, and a slim volume on architectural features of historic homes. "All from the same collection, I'd wager," Daniel said as they sat at Eleanor's dining table, the 4 books arranged before them. "But what's the connection?" Eleanor studied the titles. "Literature, plants, architecture?" She frowned, seeing no immediate pattern. "What do we know about William and Margaret Harrington?" Daniel reached for his messenger bag and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. Not as much as I'd like. William was 42 when he disappeared in 1937. 42, Eleanor interrupted. Like the marking in the books. Good catch, Daniel said with an appreciative nod. William was born in Boston, educated at Harvard, worked in finance before starting his own investment firm. He married Margaret Kensington in 1922. They had 2 children, a daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1924, and a son, James, born in 1926. The children mentioned in the letter, Eleanor murmured. Yes, after William's disappearance, Margaret maintained his innocence but eventually moved the family to her sister's home in Connecticut. The Harrington name faded from prominence, though the family never stopped trying to clear William's name. He closed his notebook. The current query came from William's great-granddaughter, Catherine Harrington Reed. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window, where darkness had fallen unnoticed during their work. We should contact her. Daniel hesitated. I think we should be certain of what we have first. If this truly leads to the missing Harrington fortune, there will be significant interest, not all of it benevolent. The Blackwood family remains influential in this region. The mention of the Blackwoods brought reality crashing back. Eleanor worked at the Blackwood wing of the Oak Ridge Library. The current Thomas Blackwood III sat on the library's board of trustees. He had been instrumental in several of Director Phillips's decisions that had gradually reduced Eleanor's responsibilities over recent years. You're right, she conceded. We need to understand what these books are telling us before we make any announcements. She glanced at the kitchen clock and was startled to see it was past 8. Oh, I've kept you much too long. Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. I haven't noticed the time at all. This is the most interesting Saturday I've had in years. The simple admission resonated with Eleanor. When had she last lost track of time in the company of another person rather than a book? Are you hungry? She asked impulsively. I could make us something. I wouldn't want to impose, he began, but his stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, answering for him. They both laughed, the sound breaking the intensity of the day's discoveries. I make a decent pasta, Eleanor offered. Nothing fancy but filling. Pasta sounds perfect, Daniel said. I could set these books up for overnight drying while you cook? If you trust me with them, that is? The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Did she trust this near stranger with books she had fought to save? With a mystery that had fallen literally into her hands? I do, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the realization that it was true. The conservation supplies are in that cabinet. I'll call you when dinner's ready. In her kitchen, Eleanor found herself moving with unexpected energy. The familiar routine of cooking, chopping garlic, boiling water, measuring olive oil, created a counterpoint to the day's revelations. From the living room came the careful sounds of Daniel working with her books, occasionally muttering to himself in concentration. It had been years since Eleanor had cooked for anyone but herself. The occasional staff potluck or holiday gathering hardly counted. Those dishes were prepared out of obligation rather than connection. This felt different. This felt like possibility. As she stirred the sauce, Eleanor caught her reflection in the window above the sink. The same face she'd seen for decades looked back at her, but something had changed. A brightness in her eyes, a slight flush to her cheeks that wasn't entirely attributable to the steam from the cooking. Ridiculous, she whispered to herself. You're behaving like a character in one of those romance novels you reshelve every day. And yet, as she called Daniel to the table and watched him appreciate her simple meal with genuine enjoyment, Eleanor couldn't help feeling that perhaps she'd been shelving those books for years without absorbing their most basic lesson. It's never too late for life to surprise you. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool, autumn asserting itself after weeks of lingering summer warmth. Eleanor woke early, her mind already racing with thoughts of William Harrington's letter and the 4 marked books. She dressed with slightly more care than her usual Sunday attire, selecting a deep blue sweater that her friend Marian had once said brought out her eyes. Not that it mattered what Daniel thought of her appearance, she told herself firmly. This was about historical discovery, not whatever else her mind kept wandering toward. Daniel arrived at 9 as they'd arranged. He carried a cardboard tray with 2 coffee cups and a paper bag that proved to contain still warm cinnamon rolls from Oak Ridge Bakery. I thought we might need fuel for our investigation, he explained, looking slightly embarrassed by his presumption. Perfect thinking, Eleanor assured him, leading the way to her dining room where she'd already arranged the 4 books and the letter on the table. They settled into what felt like a natural continuation of yesterday's collaboration, discussing the books and their possible connections while sharing breakfast. Eleanor found herself appreciating Daniel's methodical approach, so similar to her own, and his genuine enthusiasm for historical minutiae. "The key," Daniel said, tapping the letter, "is understanding what William meant by the place where we first spoke of forever. It must be significant to both him and Margaret, intimate enough that she'd immediately recognize it, but not so obvious that anyone else would." Eleanor nodded, sipping her coffee, prepared exactly as she preferred. How had he known? And then there's the sequence. Bluestones first, then count 7 and turn left at the oak. It sounds like directions to a specific location. Bluestones could be many things, Daniel mused. A path, a building material, even jewelry. What if... Eleanor hesitated, then continued when Daniel looked encouragingly at her. What if these books contain additional clues? They were marked with the same notation, possibly by William himself. Daniel's eyes widened. Of course! Let's examine them more carefully. They spent the next hour poring over the 4 volumes, checking for marginalia, underlined passages, dog-eared pages, anything that might indicate significance. Their efforts yielded results in the Wordsworth collection, a small, nearly invisible checkmark beside the poem, "She dwelt among the untrodden ways." "This is about Lucy," Daniel said, excitement coloring his voice. "A woman loved in silence who lived in nature near springs of dove." "Water," Eleanor murmured. "Could the Bluestones be near water? A spring or river?" The botanical guide revealed another subtle mark beside an entry for forget-me-nots, described as small blue flowers often found near water's edge. "Blue again," Daniel said, and another water reference. The architecture book yielded the clearest clue yet, a tiny star beside a paragraph describing garden grottos popular in 1920s estate landscaping, particularly those featuring blue-gray slate often imported from Pennsylvania quarries. "A garden grotto?" Eleanor breathed. "With blue stones, near water, possibly with forget-me-nots planted nearby." "And an oak tree," Daniel added, 7 somethings away from the Bluestones. He looked up at Eleanor, eyes bright with discovery. "We need to find where William and Margaret Harrington might have spoken of forever, near a garden grotto." Eleanor tapped her fingers thoughtfully against the table. "You mentioned they were married in 1922. Where did they live? Could there have been an estate with gardens?" Daniel was already reaching for his phone. "Let me check something." His fingers moved rapidly across the screen, eyes scanning information. "The Harringtons owned a summer home in the Berkshires about 40 miles from here. It was sold after William's disappearance. What happened to it? It changed hands several times before..." Daniel's voice trailed off, his expression shifting to one of disbelief. "Before it was purchased by Thomas Blackwood in 1945 and renamed Blackwood Retreat." The name sent a chill through Eleanor. "The Blackwood Family Retreat Center? The one they open to the public once a year for the summer charity gala?" Daniel nodded slowly. "The very same. The library fundraiser is held there every July." Eleanor had attended those galas for years, a professional obligation rather than a pleasure. The manicured grounds, the imposing colonial revival mansion, the carefully tended gardens that swept down to a small lake, all designed to showcase the Blackwood family's generosity and status. "There's a garden area on the east side," she said, memory suddenly sharp. "Stone pathways leading to a small structure near the water. I never paid it much attention." "A grotto?" Daniel asked. "It could be. It seemed purely decorative, but I only saw it from a distance." Eleanor's mind raced. "The gala isn't until July, but the grounds are open to the public on weekends from April through October," Daniel finished. "Part of the Blackwoods Community Outreach Program. I've never visited, but it's in our promotional materials at the Historical Society." They stared at each other, the implication clear. "Today is Sunday," Eleanor said slowly. "The grounds close at 5 p.m., Daniel replied. "It's just past 10 now. We could be there by 11. Eleanor thought of the remaining damaged books still awaiting her attention, of tomorrow's workday, of all the reasons to be cautious. Then she thought of William Harrington's letter, of a man trying to protect his family's future, of a mystery that had lain dormant for over 80 years until chance and a burst pipe brought it to her hands. "I'll get my coat," she said. The drive to Blackwood Retreat took just under an hour, following winding roads that climbed into the Berkshire foothills. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat of Daniel's practical sedan, watching the landscape transform from Oak Ridge's suburban streets to forests ablaze with autumn colors. They had spent the drive refining their approach. They would visit as ordinary tourists enjoying the public grounds, making their way naturally to the garden area Eleanor remembered. If it contained a grotto with blue stones, they would follow William's directions as discreetly as possible. "We're not going to dig up the Blackwood property," Eleanor had insisted, practical concerns asserting themselves. "Even if we find where William hid something, we need to be smart about this." "Agreed," Daniel had said. "Today is reconnaissance only. We verify the location, document what we find, and then approach Catherine Harrington Reed with everything. She can decide how to proceed legally." The plan was sensible, methodical, and entirely unlike anything Eleanor had done in her carefully ordered life. The realization sent a thrill through her that had nothing to do with potential lost fortunes. Blackwood Retreat appeared around a curve in the road, the main house perched elegantly on a rise overlooking a sweep of autumn-touched grounds. A discreet sign directed visitors to a parking area below the main building, where a small booth collected the $5 entrance fee. "Beautiful day for a visit?" commented the attendant, a college-aged girl who barely glanced at them as she handed over a map of the grounds. "The fall colors are at their peak." The property was large but thoughtfully arranged, with clear pathways leading to various points of interest: sculpture gardens, a small arboretum, meadow views, and the lakeside. Several other visitors strolled the grounds, mostly couples and small family groups enjoying the perfect fall day. Eleanor oriented herself using the map and her memories from summer galas. "The garden area should be this way," she said, pointing to a path that curved around the east side of the main house. "It's a bit removed from the main attractions." They walked casually, pausing occasionally to admire plantings or view the spectacular fall foliage reflected in the lake. Anyone observing would see only two middle-aged people enjoying a Sunday outing, not amateur sleuths tracking an 80-year-old mystery. As they rounded the curve of the path, Eleanor felt her heart quicken. There, nestled against a small rise in the land, was exactly what she remembered: a garden area more intimate than the grand displays near the main house. Stone pathways wound between carefully tended beds, now mostly cleared for winter save for hardy evergreen shrubs and late-blooming asters. And at the far end, partially obscured by a weeping willow, stood a structure that could only be described as a grotto. Built into the rising ground, its entrance was an arch of fitted stones leading to a recessed space. Even from this distance, Eleanor could see that many of the stones had a distinctive blue-gray cast. "Blue stones?" Daniel whispered, his voice tight with controlled excitement. They approached slowly, pretending to admire the garden design while scanning for other visitors. This area was deserted, most people apparently preferring the more spectacular vistas by the lake. The grotto was smaller than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide, its interior cool and smelling faintly of moss. The floor was paved with the same blue-gray slate as the arch, creating a peaceful retreat that would have been especially appealing in summer heat. "Blue stones first?" Daniel murmured, reciting from the letter. Eleanor examined the slate paving stones, looking for anything unusual, a marking, a particular pattern. "Then count 7 and turn left at the oak," she continued. "7 what? Steps? Stones?" They both scanned the area beyond the grotto. About 20 feet away stood a massive oak tree, its trunk so wide it would take 3 people to encircle it with their arms. "That has to be the oak," Daniel said. "But 7 what from here to there?" Eleanor's librarian mind, trained to catalog and classify, studied the scene methodically. 7 stones would cover barely 7 feet. 7 steps might reach halfway to the tree, depending on stride length. "Look," she said suddenly, pointing to the garden beds that flanked the path between the grotto and the oak. 7 sections. Daniel followed her gaze. The plantings were divided by small decorative borders of the same blue-gray slate, creating distinct garden sections on either side of the path. "You're right. 7 segments from the grotto to just before the oak." His eyes lit with understanding. "And then turn left at the oak." They walked the path slowly, counting the garden segments. At the 7th, they paused before the oak tree. To the left, the land sloped gently toward the lake, with a smaller path branching off through a stand of rhododendrons. "This way," Eleanor said, taking the left path. The rhododendrons created a natural privacy screen. Once past them, the path continued briefly before ending at a small clearing overlooking the water. Here stood a single stone bench, weathered by decades of exposure but still solid and inviting. "A place to sit and contemplate the view," Daniel observed, approaching the bench. "Private, peaceful? A place where one might speak of forever," Eleanor finished softly. Something about the setting, the sheltered intimacy, the timeless view of water and hills, made it easy to imagine a young couple sharing dreams and promises. The bench was simple but beautifully crafted from a single slab of granite set on 2 supports. No ornamentation, no inscription, nothing to suggest it was anything other than a thoughtful addition to the landscape. Daniel circled it slowly, examining every inch. If William hid something, it would need to be secure but accessible to Margaret. He knelt, running his fingers along the underside of the stone seat. "Nothing obvious here." Eleanor joined him, her knees protesting the unaccustomed position. The underside of the bench revealed nothing but smooth stone and years of cobwebs. "Maybe we're being too literal," she suggested, straightening with a wince. "William wrote about securing their future. In the 1930s, that likely meant financial instruments, stocks, bonds, account information, not physical gold or cash." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Documents that could be hidden in a small space." His gaze swept the clearing again. "If I wanted to hide something here that could withstand time and weather..." His voice trailed off as his attention fixed on the bench supports. Unlike the seat, which was a single slab, each support consisted of stacked stones fitted together. "These stones," he said, crouching again. "They're mortared together, but look at this one." He pointed to a stone near the back of the right support, slightly darker than its neighbors. "The mortar pattern is different, less weathered." Eleanor knelt beside him, ignoring the discomfort. He was right. The mortar around this particular stone showed subtle but distinct differences from the surrounding joints. "It's been removed and replaced," she breathed. They exchanged a glance of pure understanding. Without words, Daniel braced himself against the bench and carefully pressed against the stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a faint grating sound, the stone moved inward about half an inch. Daniel's fingers found the slight gap and gently worked the stone free, revealing a hollow space within the support. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as Daniel reached carefully into the cavity. His expression shifted from concentration to wonder as he withdrew a small metal box, tarnished with age but intact, its lid secured with a simple latch. "Is it locked?" Eleanor whispered, though there was no one to overhear them. Daniel tried the latch. It resisted briefly, then yielded with a click that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet clearing. He opened the lid slowly. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in what appeared to be oilcloth, the material cracked but still largely intact. With extreme care, Daniel unfolded the protective covering to reveal a leather portfolio and several small objects. "We shouldn't examine this here," Eleanor said, suddenly acutely aware of their vulnerability. "Anyone could come along." Daniel nodded, rewrapping the bundle and returning it to the box. "You're right. We've found it. That's enough for now." He hesitated, then added, "Should we replace the stone?" Eleanor considered. "Yes. Until Catherine Harrington Reed can claim her inheritance properly, we should leave everything as we found it." They carefully returned the stone to its position, pressing until it seated firmly in the mortar. To casual observation, nothing would appear disturbed. The walk back to the parking area seemed endless, both of them hyper-aware of the metal box now nestled in Daniel's messenger bag. They maintained their cover as ordinary visitors, even pausing to take a few photographs of the fall foliage with Eleanor's phone, but underneath the casual facade, their minds raced with implications of their discovery. It wasn't until they were back in Daniel's car, driving away from Blackwood Retreat, that Eleanor allowed herself to fully process what had happened. "We found it," she said, the simple statement inadequate to encompass the magnitude of their discovery. "After 80 years, we found William Harrington's hidden legacy." Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "A legacy that Thomas Blackwood's family has unwittingly hosted on their property for decades." He glanced at Eleanor. "There's a certain poetic justice to that." The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. The very family that had apparently driven William Harrington to hide his assets had ended up becoming the unknowing custodians of his secret. "What do you think is in the portfolio?" she asked. "Stock certificates, perhaps. Deeds. Banking information." Daniel kept his eyes on the winding road. "Whatever William considered valuable enough to hide from Thomas Blackwood, where should we examine it?" The question carried weight beyond its practical considerations. This was evidence in a historical mystery, potentially valuable documents that rightfully belonged to the Harrington family. "My apartment isn't secure enough." Daniel said after a moment's consideration. The Historical Society has proper facilities, but there would be questions I'm not ready to answer. My house, then, Eleanor decided. We've already established our conservation workshop there. No one will question us continuing our work with the damaged books. The drive back to Oakridge passed in contemplative silence, both of them processing the morning's discoveries. Eleanor found herself stealing glances at Daniel's profile, the serious set of his mouth, the occasional flash of excitement in his eyes when he caught her looking. This strange adventure had created a connection between them that felt both sudden and somehow inevitable, as if their separate paths had always been converging toward this point. Back at Eleanor's Victorian home, they established a proper workspace at her dining table, clean white cotton gloves, acid-free paper to protect the surface, her best reading lamp positioned for optimal light without damaging heat. With ceremonial care, Daniel placed the metal box on the table and once again opened it. Together, they unwrapped the oilcloth package, revealing its contents in full: a leather portfolio, 2 gold pocket watches, a small velvet pouch, and a fountain pen in a fitted case. "Personal treasures," Eleanor murmured, "as well as documents." The portfolio opened to reveal papers preserved in remarkable condition, protected from time and elements by their careful packaging. On top lay another letter, this one addressed simply, "For Margaret." Eleanor and Daniel exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the gravity of reading this private correspondence. But historical significance outweighed privacy concerns for words written 8 decades ago. Daniel carefully unfolded the letter and positioned it where they both could read. "My beloved Margaret, if you are reading this, you have found our salvation. Enclosed are the true records of our holdings, stocks, bonds, the deed to properties in New York and Massachusetts, and banking information for accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Thomas could not touch these. I made certain of it. The watches are for our children. My father's for James, my grandfather's for Elizabeth. The diamonds in the pouch were your mother's. Sell them only in direst need. I do not know when I can safely return, but know that every day away from you and the children is agony. Trust no one from the firm. Blackwood has eyes everywhere. I hide this on March 30th, 1937, at our bench where I first asked you to be my wife. When we meet again, it will be with our family's honor restored. All my love, eternally, William." Eleanor felt tears prickling behind her eyes at the raw emotion preserved in those careful words. A man fighting to protect his family, forced into separation and secrecy by circumstances beyond his control. "He never returned to them," she said softly. Daniel nodded, his own expression solemn. According to historical records, William Harrington was last seen in New York City on April 5, 1937, 2 days after the letter we found in the book. What happened to him? No one knows for certain. There was speculation about suicide, about fleeing the country. The official investigation concluded he had embezzled funds and disappeared with them. Daniel gestured to the portfolio. But these documents might tell a different story. They carefully examined the contents of the portfolio, stock certificates for blue-chip companies, many still in existence, property deeds, banking documents with account numbers carefully recorded, and what appeared to be evidence of financial transactions between Thomas Blackwood and several other businessmen. "This looks like proof of fraud," Daniel said, examining one document. Blackwood was manipulating accounts, transferring funds illegally. William must have discovered it. And rather than being the embezzler, he was the whistleblower, Eleanor concluded. The final document in the portfolio was the most damning, a letter from Thomas Blackwood to William, dated March 25, 1937. Harrington, your accusations are as pathetic as they are dangerous. I've built this company into what it is today, and I won't have you destroying it with your self-righteous posturing. Bring your evidence. To the authorities if you want, but consider what that would mean for your career, your reputation, your family. Be smart for once. Take the European assignment. 3 years abroad will give you perspective on what truly matters in this business. The alternative is not something either of us wants to contemplate. Blackwood. A threat, Eleanor said, the words barely audible. Thinly veiled but unmistakable. Daniel's expression had hardened. William knew too much. He was being sent away, or worse. So he gathered the evidence, hid it where only Margaret would find it, and Eleanor couldn't complete the thought. And never had the chance to tell her exactly where to look, Daniel finished grimly. The letter in the book was his attempt to reach her, but something must have happened before she received it. They sat in silence, the weight of history, of human tragedy, heavy between them. What had begun as a mystery about damaged books had become something far more profound. A family torn apart, a man silenced, justice denied for generations. "We need to contact Catherine Harrington Reed," Eleanor said finally. "This belongs to her family, not just the potential financial value, but the truth about her great-grandfather." Daniel nodded, already reaching for his phone. "I have her contact information at the Historical Society. I'll call her tomorrow." He hesitated, looking at the scattered documents. "We should document everything before we return it, for historical purposes but also as protection." They spent the next several hours photographing each document, creating a detailed inventory, and carefully repacking everything exactly as they had found it. The work was methodical and precise, a historian and a librarian applying their professional skills to preserve both physical materials and the truth they contained. It was nearly 8 o'clock when they finally finished. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, and Eleanor realized they had worked through another day with barely a pause. "You must be starving," she said, suddenly aware of her own hunger. "I could eat," Daniel admitted with a smile that transformed his serious face. "Though I'm not sure I could focus on mundane things like food after what we've discovered today. I find that historical revelations pair well with takeout," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the light tone. "There's a decent Chinese restaurant that delivers." Over cartons of kung pao chicken and vegetable lo mein, they discussed next steps. Daniel would contact Catherine Harrington Reed the following day. They would arrange a meeting to show her what they'd found. The questions of what might happen afterward, how Catherine might proceed against the Blackwood family, what legal implications might arise, how the historical record might be corrected, these were beyond their immediate control. "Whatever happens," Daniel said, twirling noodles around his chopsticks with unexpected dexterity, "we've done something important. We've uncovered the truth. Truth from damaged books that were deemed worthless," Eleanor added, the irony not lost on her. Daniel's expression softened as he looked at her across the table. "I keep thinking about how many coincidences had to align for this discovery." The pipe burst. "Your decision to rescue the books. Finding that particular copy of Great Expectations. Our meeting." He set down his chopsticks. "If any one of those things hadn't happened exactly as it did, William's letter would still be hidden between Pip and Estella," Eleanor finished, "and his family would never know the truth. I'm glad it was you who found it," Daniel said, his voice quiet but sincere. Someone who understood the value of what others discarded. The simple statement touched something deep in Eleanor. How long had it been since someone truly saw her, not just the efficient librarian, the quiet spinster, the woman whose life had somehow narrowed to cataloging other people's stories rather than living her own? "I'm glad you came looking for historical materials," she replied, matching his sincerity. Someone who recognized the significance of what we found. A moment of connection stretched between them, neither awkward nor romantic, but something perhaps more meaningful. Recognition of kindred spirits, of shared values, of mutual respect. The moment was broken by Eleanor's yawn, impossible to suppress after the emotional and physical demands of the weekend. "I should go," Daniel said, gathering their empty cartons. "We both have work tomorrow and it's been quite a 2 days. At the door, he hesitated. "Would you like to come with me when I meet Catherine? You were essential to this discovery. You should be there." "I'd like that," Eleanor said, realizing how much she meant it. This wasn't just about historical closure. It was about seeing through something they had started together. "I'll call you tomorrow after I speak with her." He shifted his messenger bag, now containing their photographic evidence rather than the actual documents, which were secured in Eleanor's home safe. "Thank you, Eleanor. For the books, for the meal, for..." He gestured vaguely. "All of this. Thank you for believing it mattered," she replied simply. After he left, Eleanor moved through her evening routine with a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Her house, filled for 2 days with Daniel's presence, felt both emptier and somehow changed, as if the space itself had been witness to something significant. In her bedroom, she paused before her bookshelf, fingers tracing the spines of beloved volumes. Books had always been her constant companions, her window to wider worlds. Now, somehow, they had become her doorway as well, a passage not just to imagined adventures, but to a real one, with real consequences and real connections. Eleanor selected her own copy of Great Expectations. From the shelf, a gift from her father on her 16th birthday, inscribed with words about finding one's path that had seemed generic then, but resonated differently now. As she settled into bed with the familiar story, Eleanor reflected that perhaps she and Pip had something in common after all, both discovering that life's greatest treasures often come from unexpected sources, and both learning that it's never too late for a new chapter to begin. Monday morning arrived with the particular clarity that follows momentous discoveries. Eleanor moved through her preparations for work with heightened awareness, as if seeing her routines from a slight distance, the same actions performed by a person who was no longer quite the same. The library awaited, its familiar rhythms both comforting and somehow constraining after the weekend's adventures. Eleanor found herself noticing details she normally overlooked: the way morning light filtered through the tall windows, the expressions of patrons browsing shelves, the quiet energy of a space dedicated to stories and knowledge. Director Phillips intercepted her before she could reach the circulation desk. "Eleanor," he said, his tone betraying mild surprise, "I half expected you to call in sick after your rescue mission on Friday." She met his gaze steadily. "The books needed attention. I gave it to them." "Yes, well," he cleared his throat. "The replacement orders have been processed. Insurance came through quickly." "I'm glad to hear it," Eleanor replied, meaning it despite everything. Books, even replacement copies, mattered. "Did you salvage anything worth keeping?" The question seemed motivated by genuine curiosity, rather than his usual dismissiveness. Eleanor considered her answer carefully. "I believe every book has potential value, James. Sometimes we just don't recognize it immediately." He looked at her oddly, perhaps sensing something different in her typically accommodating demeanor. "Right. Well, the Conservation Department at State University has offered to evaluate any items you think might be salvageable for our collection. Professional opinion, you know. The peace offering, however small, was unexpected. I'll keep that in mind. Thank you." The day progressed with its familiar rhythm, helping patrons, shelving returns, answering reference questions. Eleanor performed each task with her usual care, but found her thoughts frequently drifting to Daniel, to Catherine Harrington Reed, to the documents secure in her home safe. Shortly after lunch, her phone vibrated with a text message from Daniel. "Spoke with Catherine. She's flying in from Chicago tomorrow. Meeting set for 6 p.m. at Historical Society. She's overwhelmed but grateful. Can you make it?" Eleanor typed back immediately. "I'll be there. Does she understand what we found?" His response came quickly. "As much as I could explain by phone. Told her we found evidence that clears her great-grandfather's name. Saving details for in-person." The exchange brought the weekend's discoveries rushing back. Tomorrow evening, they would transfer custody of William Harrington's legacy to his great-granddaughter, a woman who had grown up with family stories of injustice, who had continued the quest for truth decades after those directly affected had passed away. Eleanor was shelving books in the history section when she felt someone watching her. She turned to find Thomas Blackwood III standing at the end of the aisle, his tailored suit and carefully maintained silver hair marking him as distinctly different from the library's usual patrons. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, his voice carrying the particular cadence of old money and board meetings. "Just the person I was looking for." Eleanor's heart stammered against her ribs, but years of professional composure served her well. "Mr. Blackwood, how can I help you today?" He approached with measured steps. At 70, Thomas Blackwood III remained an imposing figure, 6 feet tall with piercing blue eyes that had reportedly closed countless business deals through sheer intimidation. "James tells me you've taken a particular interest in some damaged books from our recent plumbing incident." His tone made the burst pipe sound like a minor social faux pas rather than a disaster that had destroyed hundreds of volumes. Eleanor placed the book in her hands carefully on the shelf. "I believe in preservation when possible. It's part of a librarian's responsibility." "Admirable," he said, though his tone suggested more curiosity than admiration. "I understand someone from the Historical Society has been assisting you. A Mr. Reeves?" The casual mention of Daniel sent a warning pulse through Eleanor. How did Blackwood know this? Had Director Phillips mentioned Daniel's visit? Had someone seen them together? Mr. Reeves expressed interest in any historical materials that might have been among the damaged items. She answered truthfully but selectively. "The Historical Society had recently donated some materials to our collection." Blackwood nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. "Yes, I recall approving that acquisition. Always good to support our local cultural institutions." He paused, then added with calculated casualness, "I trust nothing of significant historical value was lost?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications Eleanor couldn't fully decipher. Did he suspect something? Had they been observed at Blackwood Retreat? "Most of the damage was to modern fiction," she replied. "But Mr. Reeves and I are still assessing the historical items." Blackwood studied her for a moment longer, then nodded as if satisfied. "Well, I won't keep you from your work. The library board meets Thursday evening. I hope to hear a full report on the recovery efforts." "Of course," Eleanor said, maintaining her professional smile until he turned and walked away. Only when he had disappeared from view did she allow herself to lean against the shelves, heart racing. The encounter could have been entirely innocent, a board member checking on library operations after a significant incident. Or it could have been something else entirely. Eleanor finished her shift in a state of heightened awareness, jumping slightly when her phone vibrated again with another message from Daniel. "Need to talk. Can we meet after you finish work?" They arranged to meet at a small coffee shop 3 blocks from the library, neutral territory, public but not overly crowded on Monday afternoons. Eleanor arrived first, selecting a table in the corner with a view of both the entrance and the back exit, a precaution that would have seemed paranoid just 3 days ago. Daniel entered a few minutes later, scanning the room before spotting her. His usual tweed had been replaced by a simple button-down shirt and jeans, but his expression carried the same intensity she'd come to recognize. "Thomas Blackwood came to the library today," Eleanor said without preamble as he sat down. "Asking about the damaged books and mentioning you specifically." Daniel's expression tightened. "That's concerning, especially given what I learned this afternoon." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I did some deeper research on William Harrington's disappearance after speaking with Catherine. Police reports from 1937 show that his briefcase was found near the Hudson River 3 days after he was last seen. Empty, no sign of struggle, but suggesting he might have ended up in the river," Eleanor finished, the implication chilling. Daniel nodded grimly. "The investigation was cursory at best. Thomas Blackwood Sr., our Thomas's grandfather, had significant influence with local authorities. The case was quickly classified as a probable suicide after embezzlement. Convenient for Blackwood," Eleanor murmured. "Very. And there's more." Daniel glanced around before continuing. "I called a colleague at the National Archives this morning. Thomas Blackwood Sr. was investigated by the SEC in 1942 for financial irregularities, but the case mysteriously disappeared from prosecution dockets. The timing aligns perfectly with Blackwood Manufacturing's expansion into government contracts during the war." Eleanor processed this information, connecting it with the documents they'd found. So Thomas Sr. may have used his connections to escape prosecution for the very fraud that William Harrington discovered. "And potentially worse," Daniel added, "if William threatened to expose him." The unspoken implication hung between them, that William Harrington's disappearance might have been neither voluntary nor self-inflicted. "Do you think Thomas III knows?" Eleanor asked. "About his grandfather's actions?" Daniel considered this. "Family legacies are complicated. He might know some version of events, probably one that casts his grandfather in a more favorable light. Or he might be completely unaware. Either way, we need to be careful," Eleanor said. "If he suspects we've found something that could damage the Blackwood reputation." "Agreed." Daniel reached across the table, briefly touching her hand. "I've secured the Historical Society meeting room for tomorrow evening. Catherine's flight arrives at 3 p.m. I'll meet her at the airport and bring her directly there. I'll bring the documents from my safe," Eleanor said. "Should we involve anyone else?" "Legal counsel, perhaps. Catherine is bringing her family's attorney," Daniel replied. "And I've prepared copies of all our documentation, stored in multiple secure locations." His mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Historians' paranoia. Always preserve your sources in triplicate." The precaution should have been reassuring, but Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of the stakes involved. This wasn't just historical curiosity anymore. It was potentially exposing decades of fraud, possibly even worse crimes, by one of the most powerful families in the region. "What happens after tomorrow?" she asked. "After we give Catherine the documents?" Daniel's expression softened. "That will be her decision. She might pursue legal action to clear her great-grandfather's name. She might seek financial compensation from the Blackwood estate, or she might simply want closure for her family." "And us? What happens to us?" The question emerged more vulnerable than Eleanor had intended, encompassing concerns both practical and personal. What happened to the librarian and the historian who had stumbled onto a generations-old secret? What happened to the connection that had formed between them over damaged books and shared discovery? "I can't speak for Catherine," Daniel said carefully, "but I hope she'll acknowledge our role in this discovery appropriately." He hesitated, then added more softly, "As for us, I'd like to think this is a beginning rather than an ending." The simple statement carried weight beyond its words, an acknowledgement of possibility, of doors opening rather than closing. "I'd like that too," Eleanor replied, surprising herself with her directness. They parted soon after, each with preparations to make for tomorrow's meeting. As Eleanor walked home through streets turned golden by the setting sun, she found herself reflecting on the strange turns life could take, how a burst pipe and waterlogged books had somehow led her to historical intrigue and unexpected connection. Tomorrow would bring resolution to William Harrington's story. What it might bring to Eleanor's remained to be written. Tuesday passed in a blur of anticipation. Eleanor moved through her library duties with mechanical efficiency, her mind occupied with the evening ahead. At 5 o'clock, she claimed a migraine, not entirely untrue given the tension headache building behind her eyes, and left work early to retrieve the documents from her home safe. The Historical Society occupied a lovingly restored Victorian building near the town center, its brick facade and arched windows speaking to Oak Ridge's prosperous past. Eleanor arrived at 5:45 p.m., the metal box containing William Harrington's legacy secure in her tote bag. Daniel met her at the side entrance, his expression a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Catherine arrived safely. "She's inside with her attorney." He hesitated, then added, "She's intense. This means a great deal to her family." Eleanor nodded, understanding completely. It would. 3 generations of believing your ancestor was wrongfully accused, never being able to prove it. The meeting room Daniel had arranged was intimate but formal, a polished oak table surrounded by high-backed chairs, walls lined with historical photographs of Oak Ridge through the decades. At the table sat 2 women, one in her early 60s with steel gray hair cut in a precise bob, the other younger, perhaps 40, with a portfolio open before her. "Eleanor Whitfield," Daniel announced as they entered. "This is Catherine Harrington Reed and her attorney, Melissa Chen." Catherine rose immediately, her posture erect and dignified but her eyes bright with barely contained emotion. "Ms. Whitfield," she said, extending her hand, "I cannot begin to express my family's gratitude for what you've discovered." There was something in Catherine's features, a firmness around the jaw, a directness in her gaze, that made Eleanor wonder if William Harrington had looked similar. Did family resemblances persist across 3 generations? Did something of William live on in this woman who had never known him but had carried his vindication as a personal mission? "I'm very pleased to meet you," Eleanor replied, clasping Catherine's hand firmly. "And I'm grateful that Daniel recognized the significance of what we found." The attorney, Melissa Chen, remained more reserved, offering a professional nod. "Mr. Reeves has explained the circumstances of your discovery. We'll need to document the chain of custody carefully." "Of course," Eleanor agreed, placing her tote bag on the table. "Everything is exactly as we found it, though we did photograph the contents for documentation." With ceremonial care, Eleanor removed the metal box and placed it before Catherine. The moment felt weighted with history, a physical link to a man who had disappeared 83 years ago, whose last acts had included hiding this legacy for his family. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the box. "May I?" "Of course," Eleanor said softly. "It belongs to your family." For the next hour, they reviewed the contents together. Catherine examined each document, each personal item, with reverent attention. The gold watches, her great-grandfather's legacy to children who never received them. The small pouch of diamonds, emergency resources for a family left vulnerable. The damning letter from Thomas Blackwood Sr. that transformed understanding of William's disappearance from disgrace to potential martyrdom. "All these years," Catherine murmured, holding the letter with careful fingers. "My grandmother, William's daughter Elizabeth, spent her entire life trying to clear his name. She hired investigators, wrote to newspapers, petitioned courts. No one would listen. The Blackwood version of events was too deeply entrenched. Elizabeth never gave up then," Daniel said. Catherine's expression softened with memory. Never. Even in her 90s, confined to a nursing home, she would tell anyone who would listen that her father was an honorable man who had been destroyed by Thomas Blackwood. She looked up at Eleanor and Daniel. She died believing no one outside our family would ever accept that truth. The attorney, who had been methodically documenting each item, looked up from her notes. These documents provide compelling evidence for several potential legal actions. The statute of limitations has expired on any criminal charges, but there are civil remedies available, clearing William Harrington's name officially, potential claims against the Blackwood estate for damages to your family resulting from wrongful actions. "And the financial instruments?" Daniel asked. "The stocks, the banking information?" Ms. Chen's expression remained carefully neutral. "Some may still have value. The Swiss accounts, if they remained open, would have accumulated significant interest. The stocks in companies that still exist could be worth substantial sums. The property deeds would need research to determine current ownership and potential claims." She glanced at Catherine. "We're potentially discussing a significant amount of money, depending on how these assets were handled over time." "The money is secondary," Catherine said firmly. "My family wants the truth recognized. William Harrington deserves to have his name cleared." Eleanor found herself deeply moved by Catherine's certainty, her dedication to a principle that transcended practical considerations. How many families would prioritize historical justice over financial compensation? "What happens next?" she asked. Ms. Chen closed her portfolio. "We'll secure these materials immediately. I've arranged for a safety deposit box at Oak Ridge National Bank for temporary storage until we return to Chicago. Then we'll begin the process of authentication, research, and preparing potential legal actions." "How public will this become?" Daniel asked, the question directed primarily at Catherine. She considered this carefully. "That depends partly on how the Blackwood family responds. If they acknowledge the truth and make appropriate amends, perhaps this can be resolved quietly." Her expression hardened slightly. "If they resist or deny, then yes, it will become very public. My grandmother deserved to see her father's name cleared. Since she cannot, I'll ensure the record is corrected, whatever that requires." The meeting concluded with expressions of gratitude and exchanges of contact information. Catherine would remain in Oak Ridge for 2 more days, securing the documents and conducting preliminary research with Ms. Chen. She invited Eleanor and Daniel to dinner the following evening. "A proper thank you for what you've done for my family." As they walked Catherine and Ms. Chen to their waiting taxi, the attorney pulled Daniel aside briefly while Catherine engaged Eleanor in conversation about the library's historical collections. "What was that about?" Eleanor asked as they watched the taxi drive away. Daniel looked slightly uncomfortable. "Ms. Chen wanted to discuss potential compensation for our role in the discovery. I told her that wasn't why we did this." "It wasn't," Eleanor agreed immediately. But she hesitated, considering practicalities. "If this does result in significant recovery of assets for the Harrington family, it would be reasonable for them to acknowledge our contribution." That's essentially what Ms. Chen said. Daniel smiled slightly. She mentioned the concept of finder's fee in historical recovery cases. The concept was simultaneously appealing and unsettling. Eleanor hadn't rescued those books for potential financial reward. She'd done it because books mattered, because discarding knowledge felt fundamentally wrong to her librarian's soul. And yet, the potential validation of that choice, the practical acknowledgement of value where others had seen only damaged goods, carried its own significance. "Whatever happens," she said finally, "we did the right thing. William's truth deserved to be found." Daniel nodded, his expression warming as he looked at her. "Speaking of finding things," he hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Would you like to have dinner? Just us, I mean." "Tonight." The invitation hung between them, simple words carrying complex implications. This wasn't about historical research or document preservation or professional collaboration. This was personal, a step toward something neither had explicitly named, but both had increasingly acknowledged. "I'd like that very much," Eleanor said, the words coming easily despite years of cautious solitude. They chose a small Italian restaurant several blocks from the Historical Society, neutral ground again, but this time selected for warmth and intimacy rather than strategic visibility. Over pasta and wine, their conversation shifted from William Harrington's legacy to their own stories. Eleanor spoke of growing up in Oak Ridge, of parents who had valued education and books, of choosing library science because she believed in the democratic power of knowledge freely available to all. She described her gradual displacement at the library as budgets tightened and priorities shifted, her growing sense of becoming as outdated as the card catalog she had once maintained. Daniel shared his path to historical research, an undergraduate fascination with primary sources that led to graduate studies and eventually to the small but meaningful position at Oak Ridge Historical Society. He spoke of the satisfaction of connecting communities with their own histories, of the perpetual challenge of funding and public interest, of finding purpose in preserving stories that might otherwise be lost. "Do you ever regret staying in Oak Ridge?" he asked as they shared tiramisu. "You could have worked at major libraries, research institutions." Eleanor considered this question more seriously than she might have a week ago. "I used to think I stayed for my parents, to care for them as they aged. After they passed, I told myself I stayed because Oak Ridge needed a librarian who understood its history and community." She traced the rim of her water glass with one finger. "But honestly, I think I stayed because it was comfortable, known, safe." "And now?" Daniel's question was gentle but direct. "Now I'm not sure comfort is enough anymore." The admission felt both frightening and liberating. "This weekend showed me there are discoveries to be made, connections to forge, that I never anticipated. That perhaps I've been too quick to shelve my own story." Daniel's smile warmed his serious features. "I think your story is just reaching its most interesting chapters." After dinner, he walked her home through streets quieted by evening, their conversation continuing with the easy flow they'd established over shared research and Chinese takeout. At her door, a moment of awkwardness finally found them, the transitional uncertainty of something moving from professional to personal. "Thank you," Eleanor said simply. "Not just for dinner, for seeing value where others didn't. In the books, in their story." She hesitated, then added more softly, "In me." Daniel stepped closer, his expression earnest in the porch light. "Eleanor, finding those books, finding you, has been the most unexpected and wonderful discovery of my career." With careful deliberation, he took her hand. "I'd very much like to see where this particular historical development leads." "So would I," she replied, surprising herself with her certainty. His kiss was gentle, brief, but full of promise, like the opening chapter of a book you know immediately will become a favorite. When they parted, Eleanor felt a buoyancy she hadn't experienced in years, perhaps decades. "Dinner tomorrow with Catherine," Daniel reminded her. "I'll pick you up at 7? "I'll be ready," Eleanor promised, the words feeling like they applied to more than just dinner plans. Wednesday brought a strange dichotomy. The familiar routines of Eleanor's library work contrasted sharply with her growing awareness of the extraordinary developments in her personal life. She moved through her duties with outward calm, helping patrons locate materials, processing returns, answering reference questions. Yet internally, she felt transformed, as if she'd stepped into one of the novels she'd spent decades recommending to others. Just after lunch, her carefully maintained equilibrium was disrupted by the arrival of Thomas Blackwood III. Unlike his previous visit, this time he made no pretense of casual inquiry. He approached the reference desk directly, his normally controlled expression tightened with barely concealed tension. "Ms. Whitfield," he said without preamble, "I understand you had visitors at the Historical Society last evening. From out of town." The statement, delivered with such certainty, sent a chill through Eleanor. How did he know? Who was watching them? "The Historical Society hosts researchers regularly," she replied, keeping her voice neutral despite her racing heart. "Many come from outside Oak Ridge." Blackwood's eyes, the same piercing blue that gazed from portraits throughout the library's Blackwood wing, fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. "This particular visitor's name is Catherine Harrington Reed. Does that name mean anything to you?" The direct question left little room for evasion. Eleanor considered her options rapidly. Denial would be pointless if Blackwood already had confirmation of Catherine's presence, and potentially damaging to her own credibility. "Mrs. Reed consulted with the Historical Society about some family research," she said carefully. "As a librarian with expertise in local history, I was asked to assist." "Family research," Blackwood repeated the words with delicate emphasis. "Specifically, research about William Harrington, I presume?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the research interests of Historical Society patrons, Mr. Blackwood." Eleanor maintained her professional demeanor through sheer force of will. "Just as I would protect your privacy if you consulted our resources." A flash of something, anger? Concern? Crossed his features before his composed mask returned. "Ms. Whitfield, I've respected your work at this library for many years. You've maintained standards of excellence even as institutions like ours face modernization challenges." He leaned slightly closer. That's why I'm speaking to you directly, professional to professional. If you've discovered materials relating to William Harrington and the Blackwood family, I would appreciate the opportunity to review them before they become part of any public record. The careful phrasing couldn't disguise the implicit pressure in his request. Eleanor felt the weight of institutional politics pressing down. Thomas Blackwood III was not merely a powerful community member, but a key library benefactor, a board member who influenced budgets, staffing decisions, her very livelihood. Yet stronger than this practical concern was her certainty about the documents in Catherine's possession. They belonged to the Harrington family. William had hidden them specifically to keep them from Thomas Blackwood Sr. Eleanor would not be the one to betray that trust 83 years later. Any historical materials discovered through the library's collections would follow our established protocols for processing and access, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm sure the Historical Society operates with similar professional standards. Blackwood studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I see. He straightened, adjusting his already immaculate suit jacket. I had hoped we might address this situation collegially. If that's not possible, other approaches may become necessary. The thinly veiled threat hung between them. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, drawing on decades of professional dignity. The library closes at 8 this evening, Mr. Blackwood. If you wish to conduct research in our historical collections, I'd be happy to assist you during our regular hours. Something like grudging respect flickered across his features before he nodded curtly and turned to leave. Only when the main doors closed behind him did Eleanor allow herself to exhale fully, hands trembling slightly as she reached for her phone. She texted Daniel immediately. Blackwood just confronted me at the library. Knows about Catherine. Asked to see any materials before they become public record. Implied threats. His response came quickly. Just warned Catherine. She's moved everything to safety deposit box already. Are you okay? Fine for now, she replied, but concerned about how he knew. Someone must be watching. We'll discuss tonight. Be careful. Call if anything else happens. The remainder of Eleanor's workday passed in a state of heightened vigilance. She found herself noting every patron who entered, analyzing their behavior for signs of unusual interest in her activities. The familiar library suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable, its glass walls and open layout offering little privacy. At 5 o'clock, she left promptly, declining a colleague's invitation for after-work coffee with an apologetic smile. The walk home took her past familiar landmarks, the park where she sometimes read during lunch breaks, the bakery where she bought occasional weekend treats, the bookstore that special-ordered titles the library couldn't afford. Ordinary places that now seemed charged with new significance, as if she were seeing her own life from a different angle. At home, Eleanor prepared for dinner with unusual care, selecting a deep burgundy dress she hadn't worn in years and taking extra time with her appearance. The woman who gazed back from her mirror looked both familiar and changed, the same features she'd known all her life somehow rearranged by recent events into something more vibrant, more present. Daniel arrived precisely at 7, his expression brightening visibly when she opened the door. "You look beautiful," he said with unaffected sincerity. "Thank you." Eleanor accepted the compliment without her usual deflection. "You look rather nice yourself." And he did, his academic tweeds replaced by a charcoal suit that suggested he too had taken special care with his appearance tonight. In the car, she briefed him fully on her encounter with Blackwood. Daniel listened with growing concern, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "He's worried," Daniel concluded. "The Blackwood family has built their reputation on Thomas Sr.'s business success. If evidence emerges that it was founded on fraud, potentially even worse crimes, do you think he knows exactly what his grandfather did?" Eleanor asked. Daniel considered this. "He knows something. Whether it's the complete truth or a sanitized family version, I can't say. But he's clearly concerned enough to make direct threats, however veiled. He has significant influence in Oak Ridge," Eleanor noted. "The library board, the hospital foundation, the community development council, all have Blackwood representation or funding, which is why Catherine moved quickly to secure the documents." Daniel glanced at her. She also filed preliminary legal notices this afternoon, formal recognition of potential claims against Blackwood assets, and an official request to reopen investigation into William Harrington's disappearance. The implications settled heavily between them. Catherine was moving faster than Eleanor had anticipated, escalating a conflict that had lain dormant for generations. "We're in the middle of something much bigger than damaged books now," she murmured. Daniel reached across to take her hand briefly. We are, but we're on the right side of it. The restaurant Catherine had selected was Oak Ridge's finest, an elegant establishment overlooking the river that had once powered the town's mills. As they were escorted to a private dining room, Eleanor noted the discreet security presence, two men in conservative suits whose watchful posture suggested professional protection rather than restaurant staff. Catherine rose to greet them, elegant in navy blue, her expression warming as she made introductions to a distinguished older man at her side. Eleanor, Daniel, this is my husband, James Reed. He flew in this afternoon. James Reed had the weathered good looks of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors, his handshake firm and direct. Catherine has told me everything, he said. Our family owes you both an immeasurable debt. We did what anyone would do with such a discovery. Eleanor demurred. No, Catherine said firmly. You didn't. Most people would have discarded those damaged books without a second thought. Most people wouldn't have recognized the significance of William's letter or gone to the effort you both did to uncover the truth. Her expression softened. You restored something precious to our family, not just potential assets, but dignity, honor. The dinner that followed was both celebratory and strategic. Catherine explained that she had engaged additional legal counsel specialized in historical asset recovery, as well as a former FBI investigator to examine the circumstances of William's disappearance. The evidence is compelling, she said as they finished their entrees. William discovered fraudulent transactions in 1937, confronted Thomas Blackwood Sr., and was threatened. He secured evidence and family assets, attempted to communicate their location to Margaret, and then disappeared days later. The timing is certainly suspicious, Daniel agreed. But after 83 years, proving anything beyond financial impropriety will be challenging. James Reed, who had remained relatively quiet through dinner, leaned forward. It's not about criminal prosecution at this point. The principals are long dead. It's about historical justice, correcting the record so that William is remembered for his integrity rather than as an embezzler who abandoned his family. And the financial aspects? Eleanor asked carefully. Catherine and James exchanged glances before Catherine answered. There will be significant value recovered. The Swiss accounts were never closed. They've been accumulating interest for 8 decades. Several of the stock certificates represent holdings in companies that have thrived. The property deeds may be more complicated, but even there's potential for substantial claims. She reached into an elegant handbag and withdrew an envelope, sliding it across the table. Which brings us to this. Ms. Chen has prepared an agreement recognizing your role in this discovery. A finder's fee, essentially, 10% of all recovered assets, to be divided equally between you. Eleanor stared at the envelope, momentarily speechless. Daniel recovered first. That's extremely generous, but not necessary. We weren't seeking compensation. We know that, James said, which is precisely why you deserve it. This isn't charity or excessive gratitude. It's fair recognition of the value you've created through your actions. The preliminary estimate suggests the total recovery could exceed $20 million. Catherine added quietly. Without you, it would have remained 0. 10% seems entirely reasonable. The figure was staggering, far beyond anything Eleanor had contemplated. A portion of $20 million would transform her life completely. No more worrying about retirement on a librarian's modest pension. No more making careful calculations before every major purchase. Freedom to travel, to pursue projects of personal significance rather than institutional necessity. This is unexpected, she said finally. We'll need time to consider it properly. Of course, Catherine agreed. There's no rush on your decision. The full recovery process will take months, possibly years. As dinner concluded, Catherine and James shared their immediate plans, returning to Chicago the following day, beginning formal legal proceedings, engaging specialists to authenticate and value the recovered assets. We'll keep you informed every step of the way, Catherine promised as they parted outside the restaurant. Regardless of whether you accept the finder's fee agreement, you're part of our family's story now. The weight of these words stayed with Eleanor as Daniel drove them back through Oak Ridge's quiet streets. Neither spoke immediately, both processing the evening's revelations and offers. $20 million, Daniel said finally, breaking the silence as they approached Eleanor's home. Or rather, $2 million each if Catherine's estimates are accurate. It seems unreal, Eleanor admitted, like something from a novel rather than actual possibility. Daniel parked in front of her house but made no move to exit the car immediately. What would you do if the money becomes real? The question deserved serious consideration. Eleanor gazed out at her family home, comfortable, familiar, filled with memories both cherished and limiting. "I think I'd travel first," she said slowly. "See the great libraries of the world that I've only read about. The Library of Congress, the British Library, Trinity College Dublin." A smile touched her lips. "I'd buy books without checking the price. Good editions, not just what fits the budget." "And professionally?" Daniel's question was gentle but direct. "Would you stay at Oak Ridge Library?" The question struck at something Eleanor had been avoiding confronting directly. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've defined myself as Oak Ridge's librarian for so long. But the library has been changing, becoming less about books and preservation, more about technology and community space." She sighed. "Important evolutions, certainly, but perhaps no longer the best fit for my particular passions. You could create something new," Daniel suggested. "A specialized collection, a conservation center for damaged books, a historical archive that preserves what others might discard." The possibility resonated unexpectedly. Not retirement, Eleanor couldn't imagine days without purpose, but redirection. Using her skills and knowledge in ways that aligned more perfectly with her values. "What about you?" she asked. "What would you do with unexpected wealth?" Daniel's expression turned thoughtful. "Expand the Historical Society's capabilities, certainly. Fund proper archival storage, digitization projects." He hesitated, then added more softly, "And perhaps find the courage to write the historical studies I've been researching for years, but never committed to paper. Take some risks professionally that financial constraints have made difficult. You should write those studies regardless," Eleanor said with sudden certainty. "Your perspective matters." He smiled at that, reaching across to take her hand. "So does yours." The simple exchange carried weight beyond its words. Mutual recognition, mutual encouragement, mutual seeing. How strange and wonderful to find such connection through damaged books and historical mysteries. At her door, their goodnight kiss lingered longer than the previous evenings, deepening with shared emotion and growing comfort. When they finally parted, Eleanor felt a curious blend of excitement and peace, the thrill of new possibility balanced by the rightness of genuine connection. "Tomorrow?" Daniel asked, the single word encompassing multiple questions. "Tomorrow?" Eleanor confirmed. "Whatever comes next." As she prepared for bed that night, Eleanor found herself contemplating futures she had never previously allowed herself to imagine. Professional reinvention, financial security, partnership rather than solitude. Possibilities emerging from the waterlogged pages of books others had deemed worthless. She fell asleep wondering what William Harrington would think of how his hidden legacy had not only preserved his family's fortunes, but had somehow, across decades, helped spark new beginnings for a librarian who believed in saving damaged books. Thursday morning greeted Eleanor with soft autumn sunshine and a text message from Daniel. "Breakfast before work? Coffee shop on Elm?" The invitation brought an immediate smile. This developing pattern, beginning days together rather than merely ending them, felt significant in its simple domesticity, its implication of continuing connection. Over coffee and pastries, they discussed Catherine's offer more seriously, exploring implications and possibilities. Daniel had researched similar cases overnight, historical discoveries that led to significant asset recovery, and found precedent for the arrangement Catherine proposed. "Legally and ethically, it seems sound," he concluded, "though I understand your hesitation. It's a life-changing amount." "That's precisely what gives me pause," Eleanor admitted. "I've lived a certain way, made choices within specific constraints for decades. Sudden wealth isn't just opportunity, it's responsibility." Daniel nodded understanding. "We have time to decide. Catherine said the recovery process will take months. And in the meantime," Eleanor added, glancing at her watch, "we have our regular lives to attend to. I'm due at the library in 20 minutes. They parted with casual ease that belied the magnitude of their shared experiences. A quick kiss, promises to talk later, plans forming for the weekend ahead. Eleanor walked to the library with lightened steps, autumn leaves crunching beneath her sensible shoes as she contemplated the day ahead. The morning passed uneventfully. A children's story hour, collection development decisions, the familiar rhythm of books leaving and returning. Shortly before lunch, Eleanor received an unexpected summons to Director Phillips' office. She found him uncharacteristically agitated, pacing behind his desk rather than seated in his usual position of administrative authority. "Eleanor, He began without preliminary pleasantries. "I've received a concerning call from Thomas Blackwood." She had anticipated this, had prepared herself for the conversation since Tuesday's confrontation. "I see. He claims you've been involved in research that could potentially damage the Blackwood family reputation." Phillips stopped pacing to look at her directly. "Research conducted partly using library materials, but without proper institutional oversight." "That's not accurate," Eleanor replied calmly. "The materials in question came from damaged books that were being discarded. As they were no longer library property, no institutional oversight was required." Phillips frowned. Blackwood specifically mentioned documents relating to his grandfather and some business dispute from the 1930s. "I'm not at liberty to discuss materials that are now in private hands," Eleanor said, the careful phrasing deliberate. "But I can assure you that my actions have been professionally and ethically appropriate throughout." "Eleanor," Phillips sighed, dropping into his chair. "You know the Blackwood family's importance to this library. The Blackwood Wing, annual donations, board influence." He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "Thomas is demanding your suspension pending an investigation into misappropriation of library resources." The threat was as expected as it was unjust. Eleanor felt a curious calm descend, the tranquility of absolute certainty about her position. "James," she said, using his first name deliberately, "I've served this library faithfully for 23 years. In that time, I've never misappropriated resources, violated professional ethics, or acted against this institution's best interests." "I know that," he acknowledged, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "But Blackwood is threatening to withdraw funding if we don't address his concerns." "Then you face a choice," Eleanor said simply, "between integrity and expedience." Phillips winced. "That's unfairly reductive." "Perhaps," she conceded. "But sometimes complex situations do reduce to fundamental principles. In this case, does the library stand by a dedicated professional acting ethically, or does it sacrifice her to appease a donor?" The blunt assessment hung between them. Phillips looked away first, his expression troubled. "I've scheduled an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning," he said finally. "I'd like you to attend, present your side of this situation." "Without disclosing confidential information that isn't mine to share," Eleanor clarified. "Within appropriate professional boundaries," Phillips agreed. 9 a.m. boardroom. As Eleanor left his office, she felt oddly unburdened rather than concerned. The situation was escalating precisely as she might have predicted. Institutional politics, power dynamics, the inevitable friction when long-buried truths threatened comfortable narratives. Yet she found herself unafraid. Whether this arose from the security of Catherine's offer, the support of Daniel's partnership, or simply the confidence of knowing she stood on the right side of history, Eleanor couldn't precisely say. Perhaps it was a combination of all three, creating a foundation solid enough to withstand whatever pressures Thomas Blackwood might bring to bear. She texted Daniel immediately. "Emergency board meeting tomorrow, a.m. Blackwood pressuring for my suspension. Could use moral support afterward, if not during." His response was immediate and unequivocal. "I'll be there. Outside if they won't allow me in." This is wrong on every level. The remainder of her workday passed in a strange limbo, performing familiar duties while acutely aware that by this time tomorrow, her professional standing might be fundamentally altered. Eleanor found herself noting small details of the library with unusual attention. The way afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, the particular smell of books and wood polish, the acoustic quality of voices in the reading room. Memorizing, perhaps, what she might soon be leaving behind. As closing time approached, Eleanor was shelving returns in the historical fiction section when she sensed someone watching her. She turned to find an elderly woman standing at the end of the aisle, leaning slightly on a carved wooden cane. "Ms. Whitfield?" the woman asked, her voice surprisingly strong despite her apparent frailty. "I wonder if I might have a word." "Of course," Eleanor replied, placing the final book on its shelf. "How can I help you?" The woman glanced around before speaking again, her voice lowered. "My name is Virginia Blackwood, Thomas's aunt. I understand you found something concerning my father." Eleanor kept her expression neutral despite her surprise. Virginia Blackwood, Thomas Sr.'s daughter, Thomas III's aunt, was rarely seen in Oak Ridge these days. At least in her 80s, she had reportedly lived primarily in Boston for decades, maintaining only minimal connection to the family business interests. "Ms. Blackwood," Eleanor acknowledged with respectful caution. "What specifically brings you to the library today?" Virginia's pale blue eyes, the distinctive Blackwood feature, studied Eleanor with surprising sharpness. Not pretense or evasion, certainly. "I've had quite enough of those from my nephew." She gestured to a nearby reading nook. "Might we sit?" "My joints aren't what they once were." Once settled in adjacent armchairs, Virginia continued, her manner direct but not unkind. "Thomas called me yesterday, quite agitated about some documents you've allegedly discovered. Documents concerning my father and William Harrington." Eleanor maintained her professional composure. "I'm not at liberty to discuss materials that may be in private hands, Ms. Blackwood." A thin smile crossed Virginia's lined face. "Very proper. But perhaps I can speak instead, and you can simply listen." She adjusted her position, wincing slightly. "I was 12 years old in 1937 when William Harrington disappeared. Old enough to observe, to remember, to draw conclusions even a child might make when her father's behavior suddenly changes." Eleanor remained silent, sensing the importance of whatever Virginia had come to share. "My father was not a kind man, Ms. Whitfield. Successful in business, certainly. Respected, feared, obeyed. But not kind, not gentle, not particularly troubled by ethical constraints when they interfered with his ambitions." Virginia's gaze turned distant, focusing on memories 8 decades past. "After William disappeared, my father changed. Began drinking heavily. Had nightmares that would wake the household. Became obsessed with the river, with boats, with things weighted and sinking." The implications sent a chill through Eleanor despite the library's warmth. "I never knew precisely what happened," Virginia continued. "Children weren't included in adult conversations in those days, but I formed my suspicions that only strengthened as I grew older and understood more about my father's business practices, his ruthlessness, his capacity for eliminating obstacles." "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor asked quietly. Virginia's focus sharpened, returning fully to the present. "Because Thomas is preparing to fight whatever has been discovered. To protect the family name, the family legacy, as he understands it." Her expression softened slightly. "But there are different understandings of legacy, Ms. Whitfield. Different visions of what should be preserved and what should perhaps finally be exposed to light." "You want the truth to come out?" Eleanor realized. "I want justice," Virginia corrected gently. "However belated. For William Harrington, certainly. But also for my father, whose secrets poisoned him from within. For my family, built on foundations that were never as solid as they appeared." She leaned forward slightly. "And I want you to know that not everyone named Blackwood stands against you in this matter." The statement carried weight beyond its simple words, an acknowledgement of alliance from an unexpected quarter, a fracture in what might have appeared a unified opposition. "The board meeting tomorrow," Eleanor began carefully. "We'll proceed as Thomas has arranged," Virginia finished. "My nephew controls majority interests now. I have neither the health nor the inclination for open conflict with him." She reached into an elegant handbag and withdrew a sealed envelope. "But perhaps this might be of use to the Harrington family. My personal recollections, dated and notarized, of events surrounding William's disappearance and my father's subsequent behavior." Eleanor accepted the envelope with appropriate gravity. "I'll ensure it reaches the appropriate parties. See that you do." Virginia rose with deliberate care, waving away Eleanor's offered assistance. "One final thing, Ms. Whitfield. Thomas will use institutional leverage against you tomorrow. Funding, influence, pressure on those whose positions depend on Blackwood goodwill." Her eyes, sharp despite her years, held Eleanor's steadily. "Remember that institutions are ultimately made of people, and people can surprise you with where they place their loyalty when fundamental principles are at stake." With that cryptic encouragement, Virginia Blackwood departed as unexpectedly as she had arrived, leaving Eleanor holding both a sealed envelope and a renewed sense that the coming confrontation would involve dimensions beyond simple institutional politics. That evening, Eleanor shared Virginia's visit with Daniel over dinner at her home. He listened with growing amazement as she recounted the conversation and showed him the sealed envelope. "This could be crucial testimony," he said. "A contemporaneous witness, however young, from within the Blackwood family itself. Who specifically came to ensure I had her statement before tomorrow's board meeting?" Eleanor added, the timing's significance not lost on either of them. They spent the evening preparing for the meeting, reviewing facts, clarifying timeline, establishing what Eleanor could ethically disclose and what remained protected by her commitment to Catherine. Daniel's support was both practical and emotional, his certainty about the righteousness of their position bolstering Eleanor's own resolve. When he left, later than intended, their planning interrupted by increasingly comfortable interludes of connection, Eleanor found herself contemplating how completely her life had transformed in less than a week. From the routine isolation she had gradually accepted as her portion to this new landscape of partnership, purpose, and possibility. Whatever the board decided tomorrow, she realized, she had already gained far more than she might lose. Friday dawned clear and cool, autumn asserting itself with crisp air and slanting golden light. Eleanor dressed with particular care, a charcoal suit she reserved for the most formal library functions, accessorized with a simple strand of pearls that had belonged to her mother, professional armor for professional battle. Daniel met her outside the library at 8:45, his expression conveying both concern and certainty. "Ready? As I'll ever be," Eleanor replied, drawing strength from his presence. The boardroom occupied the top floor of the library's original building, a formal space of polished oak and leaded glass windows, rarely used except for official meetings. As Eleanor entered, she noted the composition of attendees with a librarian's attention to detail. Director Phillips sat at the head of the table, expression carefully neutral. Thomas Blackwood III occupied the chair to his right, immaculately dressed and radiating controlled tension. The remaining seats held various board members, community leaders, academic representatives, local business owners, most looking uncomfortable with the hastily called emergency session. And at the far end, to Eleanor's surprise, sat Virginia Blackwood, her posture regal despite her years, her presence clearly unexpected by her nephew, judging by his poorly concealed consternation. "Aunt Virginia," he acknowledged stiffly. "I wasn't aware you'd be joining us." "The privileges of age, Thomas," she replied with serene assurance. "One attends what one wishes, regardless of invitation." Her gaze shifted to Eleanor. "Ms. Whitfield, how good to see you again." Director Phillips cleared his throat, reclaiming attention. "Let's bring this meeting to order. We're here to address concerns raised by Mr. Blackwood regarding potential misuse of library resources and materials by Ms. Whitfield." Thomas Blackwood straightened, prepared to present his case. "Thank you, Director. My concerns are straightforward. Ms. Whitfield has been involved in research utilizing materials connected to my family, specifically my grandfather, without proper authorization or oversight. This research appears designed to cast aspersions on the Blackwood family reputation through selective interpretation of historical documents." He paused, gaze sweeping the assembled board members. "Given the Blackwood family's long-standing support of this institution, I find this activity particularly troubling. I've requested Ms. Whitfield's suspension pending full investigation of how these materials were obtained and what has been done with them." Director Phillips nodded. "Ms. Whitfield, would you care to respond?" Eleanor rose, her calm exterior belying the rapid beat of her heart. "Thank you, Director Phillips. I'd like to address Mr. Blackwood's concerns directly and factually." She outlined the sequence of events with precise clarity: the pipe burst, the damaged books being discarded, her personal decision to attempt conservation of materials the library had officially abandoned. "No library resources were misappropriated," she concluded. "The books in question had been designated as garbage and were being thrown away. Any personal time and resources I dedicated to their salvage were my own, not the institution's." "And the materials allegedly concerning my family?" Thomas pressed. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "During the conservation process, certain historical documents were discovered preserved within one of the damaged books. These documents appear to be of legitimate historical significance and potential legal importance to their rightful owners." "Which would be?" Thomas demanded. "Not the library," Eleanor replied carefully, "as they were never cataloged as part of our collection. Not the Blackwood family, as they were not created by or addressed to Blackwoods. The documents appear to be the personal property of the Harrington family, to whom they have been returned." A murmur ran through the board members at this direct confirmation of the Harrington connection. Thomas's expression hardened. "So you admit to removing potentially valuable historical materials from this institution and transferring them to outside parties?" "I admit to rescuing personal correspondence and documents from a damaged book that was being discarded as garbage," Eleanor corrected, "and ensuring those materials reach their rightful owners after proper documentation of their discovery." Director Phillips intervened. "The question before this board is not the content of these materials or their ultimate disposition, but whether Ms. Whitfield violated library policies or professional ethics in her handling of them. The larger question," Thomas countered, "is whether an employee of an institution that receives significant Blackwood support should be engaging in activities potentially damaging to the Blackwood family." The naked leveraging of financial influence brought another ripple of discomfort through the board members. Eleanor noted several exchanging troubled glances at this explicit connection between funding and personnel decisions. "If I may," Virginia Blackwood's voice cut through the tension with surprising authority. All heads turned toward her as she continued, "My nephew's concern for our family reputation is commendable, if perhaps misdirected. The question we might more productively ask is not whether Ms. Whitfield has acted inappropriately, but whether the contents of these documents reveal historical truths that deserve acknowledgement, regardless of their impact on family narratives." Thomas stared at his aunt, momentarily speechless at this unexpected intervention. Virginia continued serenely, "I've provided Ms. Whitfield with my personal testimony regarding events surrounding William Harrington's disappearance in 1937 and my father's subsequent behavior. I did so voluntarily, believing that historical accuracy serves all parties better than perpetuated falsehoods, however comfortable those falsehoods might be for some." The revelation landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of reaction through the assembled board. Thomas's expression shifted from shock to controlled anger. "Aunt Virginia, with all due respect, your recollections as a child are remarkably clear," she interrupted smoothly, "and consistent with other evidence that has apparently emerged. Evidence my nephew seems quite determined to suppress rather than address honestly." Director Phillips, visibly uncomfortable with this family dispute playing out in his boardroom, attempted to refocus the discussion. "While these historical matters are certainly significant, our immediate concern is whether Ms. Whitfield's actions violated library policies." An academic representative, Dr. Helen Chen from the local university, spoke up for the first time. "From what Ms. Whitfield has described, she rescued materials that had been designated as trash on her own time and using her own resources. I fail to see any policy violation there. In fact, her actions seem commendably aligned with our profession's commitment to preservation." Several board members nodded agreement. Thomas Blackwood's jaw tightened visibly. "The library's relationship with its major donors must also be considered," he insisted. "Indeed it should," agreed Virginia unexpectedly. "Which is why I'm pleased to announce my intention to establish the Virginia Blackwood Conservation Fund, dedicated to preserving and restoring damaged materials that might otherwise be discarded due to budget constraints." She smiled serenely at the stunned expressions around the table. "An initial endowment of $5 million should provide adequate resources for the foreseeable future." The announcement landed like a thunderclap in the already charged atmosphere. Director Phillips appeared momentarily unable to speak, while Thomas stared at his aunt with naked disbelief. "Aunt Virginia, you can't possibly—" "I assure you I can, Thomas," she interrupted gently. "My portion of the Blackwood fortune has been sitting in conservative investments for decades. It's high time it served a purpose aligned with my personal values, rather than merely accumulating further wealth." She turned to Eleanor, her expression warming. "And I can think of no one better qualified to direct such a conservation initiative than Ms. Whitfield, whose commitment to preservation has been so amply demonstrated." The strategic brilliance of the move was not lost on anyone present. Virginia had effectively neutralized Thomas's financial leverage, while simultaneously creating a position that would elevate Eleanor beyond his institutional reach. Director Phillips recovered his composure first. "This is an extraordinarily generous offer, Ms. Blackwood, one the library would be honored to accept, pending formal board approval and development of proper governance structures." "Of course," Virginia agreed graciously. "I'm sure Ms. Whitfield would be happy to draft an initial proposal for the conservation program once her current situation is resolved." All eyes returned to the ostensible purpose of the meeting. In the face of Virginia's intervention and the clearly shifting sentiment among board members, Thomas Blackwood made a tactical retreat. "Perhaps I've overestimated the seriousness of the situation," he said stiffly. "If the board is satisfied with Ms. Whitfield's explanation, I won't press the matter further at this time." The relief in Director Phillips's expression was almost comical. Then, if there are no objections, I believe we can consider this matter closed. Ms. Whitfield continues in her position with no disciplinary action noted. He turned to Virginia, and we look forward to working with you on the details of your extremely generous conservation fund. As the meeting dispersed, Eleanor found herself approached by Virginia Blackwood, who took her arm with surprising strength for one so frail in appearance. "Walk with me a moment, Ms. Whitfield," she requested, though the words carried more command than petition. They moved slowly toward the elevator, Virginia's cane tapping a measured rhythm on the polished floor. When they were beyond easy hearing of others, she spoke quietly. "My nephew will not abandon his concerns so easily. Today was merely a strategic retreat, not a surrender." "I understand," Eleanor replied, "but your intervention was remarkable." A thin smile crossed Virginia's lined face. "Age has its privileges, as I mentioned. One of them is the freedom to finally act according to one's conscience without fear of consequence." She paused, her grip on Eleanor's arm tightening slightly. "The Conservation Fund is genuine, by the way. I've considered such a gift for years, but lacked the right catalyst. You provided it." "I'm honored," Eleanor said sincerely, "though I never anticipated becoming the director of a conservation program. Life rarely follows our anticipations, Ms. Whitfield. That's what keeps it interesting well into one's 8th decade." Virginia's sharp blue eyes studied Eleanor's face. "The young historian who's been assisting you, he seems capable." The apparent non sequitur surprised Eleanor. "Daniel?" "Yes, extremely capable. And dedicated to historical accuracy. Good qualities in both professional and personal connections," Virginia observed with the faintest hint of mischief. "I look forward to meeting him properly when we discuss the conservation program details." She released Eleanor's arm as they reached the elevator. "Now I believe there's someone waiting rather anxiously for news of this meeting." Sure enough, Daniel stood in the library's main lobby, his expression clearing into relief as he saw Eleanor descending the stairs alongside Virginia. Eleanor made quick introductions, amused by Daniel's barely concealed awe at meeting someone who had been a contemporary witness to events they'd been researching. After Virginia departed, declining their offer of assistance with remarkable self-sufficiency for her age, Daniel turned to Eleanor with naked curiosity. "Well, what happened?" She recounted the meeting in detail as they walked through the autumn sunshine toward a nearby cafe. Daniel's expression shifted from concern to amazement to outright delight as the story unfolded. "Virginia Blackwood created a conservation fund and offered you the directorship?" he repeated, clearly struggling to absorb this development. That's brilliant. Strategic genius. It was quite something to witness." Eleanor agreed, still processing the implications herself. "She effectively neutralized Thomas's financial leverage while creating a position where I could continue preservation work with proper resources." "Do you think you'll accept?" Daniel asked as they settled at an outdoor table, autumn leaves occasionally drifting down around them. Eleanor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think I might. It would be a natural evolution of my work, focused specifically on areas I value most deeply." She smiled slightly. "And having adequate resources for proper conservation would be a welcome change. Plus, irritating Thomas Blackwood would be a not insignificant bonus," Daniel added with a grin that transformed his scholarly features. "There is that," Eleanor admitted, returning his smile. "Though Virginia warned me he hasn't given up, merely retreated temporarily." Daniel's expression sobered. "That's probably accurate. Men like Thomas Blackwood don't abandon family legacy concerns easily." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but for today at least we've won a significant victory." She reached across the table to take his hand. "And I've discovered something important about myself in the process." "What's that?" Daniel asked, his fingers warm around hers. "That I'm stronger than I believed, more capable of change, of standing my ground, of embracing new possibilities." She met his gaze directly. "In professional matters, certainly, but in personal ones as well." The simple statement carried weight beyond its words, an acknowledgement of the deepening connection between them, of her willingness to risk the comfortable isolation she had maintained for years in favor of something more challenging, but potentially far more rewarding. Daniel's expression softened with understanding. "I've discovered something similar," he admitted. "That historical research doesn't have to remain safely in the past. That connections formed over shared discoveries can extend beyond the professional into something—" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Something transformative." The moment expanded between them, honest, vulnerable, filled with possibility. Around them, Oak Ridge continued its autumn Friday routines, people hurrying to lunch appointments, students laughing at neighboring tables, leaves drifting in the gentle breeze. Yet within their shared gaze existed something set apart from ordinary time, a recognition of paths converging toward shared future rather than parallel solitudes. "So what happens next?" Eleanor asked, the question encompassing far more than immediate plans. Daniel smiled, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her knuckles. "I believe we have dinner plans with Catherine and James tomorrow before they return to Chicago. We have Virginia Blackwood's Conservation Fund to help structure. We have Thomas Blackwood's continued opposition to navigate." His expression warmed further. "And we have whatever this is becoming between us to explore at whatever pace feels right." "That sounds like quite an agenda," Eleanor observed, though her tone conveyed nothing but pleasure at the prospect. "Full of possibilities," Daniel agreed. "And it all started with damaged books others thought worthless." The observation brought their journey full circle, from Eleanor standing at a dumpster refusing to let waterlogged volumes be discarded without effort to save them, to this moment of personal and professional transformation. From isolation to connection, from routine to adventure. "Not bad for a week's work," she said softly. As they lingered over coffee, making plans for the weekend ahead and beyond, Eleanor found herself contemplating William Harrington's legacy. He had hidden evidence to protect his family's future, never knowing that decades later, his actions would not only restore his descendants' inheritance, but would catalyst profound change in the lives of two people who had helped uncover his truth. Some books, it seemed, contained far more between their covers than even their authors could have imagined. Stories that continued to unfold long after the final page, connections that bridged decades and generations, transformations that began with the simple decision to value what others had deemed damaged beyond worth. And in that realization, Eleanor found both peace about the past and excitement for whatever chapters might yet be written in her own unfolding story.